Norah didn't remember packing her satchel. Her hands had moved without her mind, slipping things inside: an old hairbrush, a stitched linen, a Bible with its cover torn, the lace handkerchief her mother had once folded into her lunch tin. None of it made sense anymore. The front door had shut behind her with a sound louder than thunder. She hadn't even reached the edge of the road before her father spoke. "Since you care so much for them," he spat, "go live with one." No explanation, no pause, no plea for her to repent. Just those words, and the slam of a satchel into her chest like a blow. She blinked at him, her voice caught behind her ribs. "Papa." But he was already turning. Already walking back up the porch steps in that long black coat he wore when he preached. Like she was just another sinner he'd condemned from behind the pulpit. Another lost soul too far gone to save. The sky was wide and empty when she started walking. Her shoes were still beside the porch, he hadn't even let her retrieve them. Barefoot, she stepped down the dusty road lined with fences and scorched grass. Every footfall a reminder that she was no longer welcome, no longer wanted, no longer a daughter. Her name was still Norah. But that morning, it didn't feel like it belonged to anyone. The township whispered before she turned the first corner. People who had once smiled at her on Sundays now stared through their shutters. A boy shouted, "Preacher's girl's gone off to the forge." Someone else hissed, "Lying with the blacksmith now." "Is she?" She didn't answer, didn't cry. Her chin stayed high, even when her soul folded in on itself. Elijah's forge sat at the edge of town, just beyond where polite society ended and hard labor began. The air smelled of smoke and iron. The sound of hammer meeting metal rang out in rhythmic strikes. When she approached, he was shirtless, back slick with sweat, muscles moving like ropes beneath his dark skin. He paused, looked up, his brow furrowed the moment he saw her. "I didn't send for you." "I know," she said, her voice hollow. "My father gave me to you. Said it was fitting." The word "gave" hung between them like a curse. Elijah flinched, not at her presence, but at the word itself. Gave, as if she were a thing. A burden passed like property from one man to another. She felt the shame flush her cheeks, though she had done nothing wrong but care. He wiped his brow with the back of his arm, nodding toward the small house behind the forge. "There's a room in back. You'll find a cot. I won't stop you if you want to leave." But she didn't leave. That night, she sat in a room that smelled of ash and dust. There was no lace here, no candles, no embroidered cushions, no tea, just a cracked mirror, a threadbare quilt, and a silence she didn't know what to do with. No one called her Miss Calloway. No one brought her supper on a tray. She was alone. She hadn't cried when her father turned his back. Not when the townspeople laughed. Not even when Elijah said, flatly, that he hadn't asked for her. But that night, as she sat on the edge of a stranger's cot, her hands began to tremble. It wasn't just shame. It wasn't just fear. It was grief. The kind that came when a person realized their entire life had been built on conditions. On strings that could be cut the moment she strayed from expectation. She had grown up in ivory gloves and piano lessons, with white ribboned hats for Sunday service and sermons that dripped with certainty. She had always been the preacher's daughter, never Norah. Not really. And now, she was nobody. That evening, Elijah placed a bowl of stew outside her door. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just left it there, covered with a cloth, steam rising through the wooden slats like some kind of mercy. She ate slowly, alone, the flavor settling in her chest like warmth after a long freeze. She thought of her father's voice. Go live with one, as if Elijah wasn't a man, but an animal, as if she deserved to be punished by proximity to blackness. But Elijah hadn't spoken to her like she was filth. He hadn't touched her, hadn't threatened, hadn't asked why she was there. He had simply handed her space. And food. The cruelest man she had ever known had kicked her out without shoes. The man he feared most had given her dinner. Her hands trembled again, but not from fear this time. From the weight of contrast. She had never known a world without expectation, without someone defining her value, her purpose. Yet now, as she sat in this rough room that expected nothing of her, she felt something unravel. Norah didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but she knew this. Whatever came next would not be inherited or dictated. It would be chosen, even if she had to choose it barefoot. empty-handed and unwelcomed. The forge crackled outside. The metal still sang beneath Elijah's hammer. And Norah, who had been thrown away like broken glass, began, quietly, painfully, and without permission, to pick up her own pieces. The mornings came earlier now, not because the sun rose any quicker, but because Norah did, long before the rooster crowed. She would rise in the chill of the forge house, slip into the same brown dress, and begin sweeping. The dirt never seemed to settle, soot from the fire, ash from the wind, flakes of rust from the tools. It all found its way to the floor, like the town's judgment clinging to her boots. No one had spoken to her in days. At the well, women turned their backs. At the market, coins were placed in her palm without a single word. Even the children she had once tutored, bright-eyed and eager, now looked through her as if she had vanished. It wasn't just exile, it was erasure. And yet, every morning, the forge would come alive. The clang of iron, the hiss of steam, the soft grunts from Elijah as he worked with the rhythm of a man who knew labor more intimately than sleep. He rarely spoke, not out of coldness, but necessity. He had learned long ago that silence made fewer enemies. But in his quiet, Norah found something that stung more than all the whispers in town. He didn't hate her, he just didn't need her. That, somehow, made her feel even smaller. Still, she stayed. One morning, as she struggled to lift a bucket of coals, her hand blistered from the handle. She winced, dropping it onto the ground with a muffled curse. Elijah, from across the yard, didn't say a word, but later, when she returned to her room, a small tin of salve sat on her cot. No note, no explanation, just an unspoken acknowledgement. It wasn't kindness. Exactly. It was something quieter, respect. Perhaps, a recognition that she was trying. That she hadn't run. The salve smelled of cedar and mint. She used it that night with shaking fingers and fell asleep with her hands wrapped in cloth. The next day, she tried again. They worked side by side sometimes, her sorting scrap metal, him shaping wagon wheels or shoeing mules. She learned to listen to the metal. Elijah said little, but his movements taught her. When he paused to wet the iron, she did too. When he nodded slightly toward a new task, she followed. Each small gesture felt like a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter in a book only they could read. At midday, they would sit by the fire. He offered bread one day, just once, ripped in half and handed wordlessly. She took it, and for the first time in weeks, felt something warm that wasn't from the forge. That afternoon, a neighbor rode past on horseback, glaring at Norah like she had spit on his Bible. "You trade a father for a blacksmith's bed?" He sneered, loud enough for her to hear. Elijah didn't turn. He didn't raise his hammer or his voice. He just kept working. But Norah's hands shook as she scrubbed the anvil clean. Not from fear, but from fury. She wasn't in Elijah's bed. He hadn't even touched her. And yet the world had already written their story for them, one of disgrace. Not love. That night, she sat outside the forge, staring at the stars. They looked the same as they had when she was a child. But she was no longer the same girl who sat behind church windows, memorizing verses while her father condemned the world. Elijah passed by her on his way inside. His hands were blackened, shirt damp with sweat, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She looked up and asked softly, "Will they ever stop hating me?" He paused. "No," he said, after a long silence. "But hate can't live where love makes a home." She didn't respond, but those words landed somewhere deep, where nothing had touched in a long time. Over time, things change, but only in the smallest ways. She began waking to the smell of bread instead of silence. He started leaving out water for her to wash, unasked. One morning, she found a scrap of cloth folded into an apron, stitched poorly but clearly meant for her. He had made it with his own hands. That same day, she caught him watching her, not in the way men looked at women, but in the way one survivor watches another, trying to decide if they'll make it. The forge was hot that day. Her arms trembled from the tongs, her palms raw. When she let out a gasp, the metal slipping slightly, Elijah moved behind her. "Here," he murmured. He placed his hands over hers, steady, firm, his breath warm near her temple, his body close but careful. "Don't fight the weight," he said. "Lean into it." She did. Not just the metal, but the moment. That night, Norah stood by the door again. The sky above them black and endless. The house behind her quiet. And for once, she didn't feel like an intruder. Elijah passed with his lantern and stopped. "Why do you stay?" he asked, softly. Norah turned to him, eyes clear. "Because you're the only one who's never asked me to be anything else." He didn't reply, just nodded once and walked on. Inside her room, she found another bowl of stew. Still warm, still covered, and for the first time since she had arrived, she whispered a single word to the empty air. "Thank you, not just for the food, but for the silence that wasn't cruel, for the presence that wasn't conditional, for the man who never called it love, but lived like it anyway." The wind that morning carried dust and warning. From the porch, Norah could see them coming, men on horseback, boots heavy with judgment, hats low over eyes that never forgot a grudge. Sheriff Boyd led the charge, clipboard in hand, pride puffed in his chest like he was delivering justice instead of a threat. They came with laws, not torches, but Norah knew. Paper burned just the same. Inside the house, Ruth clung to the window. Wide-eyed and silent, Elijah stood by the door, steady, calloused hands brushing his apron clean. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. They had known this day would come. The town hadn't forgiven Norah for choosing Elijah, hadn't forgiven Elijah for surviving long enough to own something. And now that they had land, a home, and each other, they were dangerous. Together, they stepped outside. Elijah's hand brushed Norah's, a silent tether. The crowd stopped at the gate. A few kept their horses at a distance. Others, like Sheriff Boyd, dismounted with theatrical disdain, dusting his coat like their very existence offended him. "You know why we're here," he said flatly. "No," Norah replied. "Say it." He flinched, just a little, then straightened. "It's indecent. Two women living with a man under one roof, one of them pregnant. The other astray. There's town ordinances. You know, codes, housing laws." Elijah tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Since when do housing laws show up on horseback?" Snickers rose behind Boyd. The younger deputy shifted awkwardly, his eyes flicking between the sheriff and the couple. Boyd ignored the jab. "You've got till tomorrow. After that, this land's no longer yours." Norah stepped forward, voice clear and cold. "This land was signed over legally. Your own records show it. We are not trespassing. We are not hiding." He sneered. "You think a signature from a dead man makes this a family?" Her jaw tightened. "No. What makes this a family is what you don't understand. Loyalty, work, love without permission. You're a preacher's daughter." Boyd spat. "And now you're playing house with a blacksmith." "I'm not playing anything," she snapped. "I was given away like cattle by the very man who raised me." "And the man you mock? He gave me shelter without ever laying a hand on me. He gave me respect before he gave me his name. He gave me a home." Her voice rose. The kind of clarity that doesn't ask for attention, it demands it. "I won't be ashamed of that." The crowd murmured. "She should be." Someone hissed. Elijah stepped forward then, a folded paper in his hand. "You want law?" he asked, unfolding it slowly. "Here it is. Signed deed, witnessed and notarized. This land was mine before you rode in. And it'll be mine long after you ride out." Boyd didn't even look at it. "No piece of paper changes what you are. And no badge changes what you fear," Elijah said evenly. Norah turned to the crowd, voice steadier than it had ever been in church or choir or classroom. "You call this indecency. You say it goes against your God. But what kind of faith banishes a daughter for teaching children to read? What kind of morality calls a home filthy just because it wasn't built your way?" A breeze stirred her hair as she stepped down the porch. "I've scrubbed your floors. I've taught your children. I've listened to your sermons. And I've buried the version of myself that used to beg for your approval. I am done begging." From behind her, Ruth's small voice rang out. "We're not alone." Elijah put a hand on her shoulder. "We're a family," he said softly. Boyd scowled. "Not by law. You ain't." "No," Elijah agreed, "but by choice." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't disperse in shame. They stood, uncertain, uneasy, not because they'd changed their minds, but because something had shifted. The people they thought they could shame weren't shrinking. They were rising. "You've got until dawn," Boyd barked, turning on his heel. "After that, I'll be back. Then come back. Norah called after him. We'll still be here. The horses kicked up dust as they retreated, the crowd thinning, scattering like smoke, but the weight of their threat lingered in the air long after the hooves had faded. Inside, Ruth cried quietly into Norah's dress. Are we going to lose everything? Norah knelt. No, baby, because they can only take what we give them. That night, they didn't light lamps. They sat by the fire in silence, the room thick with unspoken fears. Elijah's hand rested on Norah's knee. Warm, grounding. I've run from flames before, he said, but I won't run from this one. Norah turned to him. Even if we lose the house? He shook his head. You are the house. And just like that, her spine straightened. At dawn, Norah braided her hair back, dressed in a clean apron, and walked into town with Elijah on one side and Ruth on the other. They didn't hide, didn't sneak. They walked right to the steps of the sheriff's office. Elijah held the deed in one hand and a copy of the town's own housing ordinance in the other. We are in full compliance, he said, and you will not erase us. Boyd didn't even open the paper, just scowled, spat, and muttered, You still don't belong. Norah smiled, arm looped through Elijah's. We don't need to belong to you. And with that, they turned their backs and walked away. They weren't looking for permission. They were claiming their place. And when they returned home, the fire was already lit, not in anger, but in defiance, in love, in something deeper than what paper could bind or a town could break. They had drawn the line. And for the first time, they weren't standing behind it. They were standing on it. Together. The rain had passed, leaving behind a sky streaked with gold and lavender. The earth smelled rich, like hope after hardship. Norah stood by the stove, hands deep in flour, working dough into shape the way she had learned from Elijah, slow, steady, no rush, no panic. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the forge in the distance. It had become the pulse of her life now, reliable, anchoring. She didn't hear the knock, just the creak of the door and the rush of air that followed. When she turned, her breath caught. A child stood there, thin, small, with wild curls and sharp eyes that didn't belong to someone so young. She wore a dress too short for her growing limbs and held a bundle wrapped in burlap like it was the last thing she owned. Elijah stood just behind her, silent but solemn. She was waiting by the river. He said quietly, said she was looking for the girl with a scar on her shoulder. Norah blinked. What? The child stepped forward. My name's Ruth, she said. My mama died last winter. Before she passed, she told me if anything ever happened, I had to find the preacher's daughter, the one he tried to break. The words hit like a stone to Norah's chest. I'm your sister, Ruth whispered. She said you'd know me by the eyes. Norah didn't move at first. Her knees felt weak, her heart fluttering with a mix of disbelief and memory. She looked down at the bundle, saw the corner of an old, creased photograph sticking out. She reached for it slowly, fingers trembling. There they were. Two girls in a faded photo. One with her old braids and Sunday dress. The other smaller, nestled at her side, forgotten by time, hidden by lies. Norah dropped to her knees, reaching for Ruth without a word, wrapping her arms around the child like she was something holy. No sobbing, no wailing, just stillness. A silence so full it nearly broke her open. You're not supposed to be dead, Norah whispered into her sister's hair. He told me you died as a baby. Ruth clutched her tighter. Mama said he gave her silver to keep quiet. Behind them, Elijah stood watch. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just kept his hand on the doorframe like he knew this moment needed nothing but space to bloom. That night, Ruth slept on the cot, curled in a blanket with the photo beside her like a talisman. Norah sat beside her, unable to sleep, brushing the girl's hair with the same motions she remembered from years ago. She had grieved a sister that never died. And now, she held her again. Elijah came in quietly, a mug of warm tea in each hand. He passed one to Norah and sat beside her. You okay? He asked. She nodded, but tears slipped down her cheeks anyway. I didn't know what it meant to lose someone you never got the chance to love. Until now. He reached over, resting a hand on her back. It wasn't meant to fix anything. Just to say I'm here. The weeks passed gently. Ruth adjusted quickly. She followed Elijah like a shadow, asking questions about the fire and tools, carrying kindling in her arms like it was treasure. At night, she helped Norah hang laundry and sweep the porch. One afternoon, as they worked together by the river, Ruth looked up suddenly and asked, "Can I call you Mama?" Norah froze, linen in her hands. "You don't have to," Ruth added quickly. "I know we just found each other." Norah knelt in the grass, cupping the girl's face. "You can call me whatever you need," she whispered, "because you're mine now, always." The words stuck in her chest, mine. Not by blood, not by birth, but by love. And then came the flutter. At first, she thought it was nerves, or too much work, but the queasiness returned each morning, along with the sudden fatigue and sharp awareness in her body. It was Elijah who noticed first, when she dropped the basket of apples and leaned against the barn door. Breath-catching. "You all right?" he asked, hand on her shoulder. She didn't answer. Instead, she took his hand, placed it on her stomach, and whispered, "I think there's someone else coming." His eyes widened, then softened. "A baby?" he breathed. Norah nodded, tears forming before she could stop them. "I didn't plan it. I didn't even think the world would let it happen." But yes. He didn't speak. He just dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead to her belly. "Our child," he whispered. "Ours." The town didn't rejoice. Of course they didn't. They whispered. They stared. They called it sin and scandal. The preacher's daughter, pregnant by the blacksmith, raising a girl that wasn't hers, living without marriage, without God, without shame. But Norah never flinched again. She walked the market with her back straight, belly showing beneath her apron. When someone refused her bread, Elijah baked his own. When someone turned Ruth away, Norah taught her at home. Their home, built not of wood, but of defiance, gentleness, and second chances. One morning, while Ruth braided flowers into Norah's hair, she said, "This baby's going to be lucky." "Why's that?" Norah smiled. "Because it's already got a whole family waiting. Even me." Norah kissed her forehead. "Especially you." And in that moment, she realized she had never needed a wedding ring. She didn't need a church's blessing. She didn't need permission to build a life that healed. She had Elijah, who kissed her hand instead of owning it. She had Ruth, who called her Mama by choice. And she had a child on the way, growing inside a body once discarded. Now a vessel of hope. They were not the family the town approved of, but they were a family nonetheless. And they were enough. The porch was no longer quiet after supper. In the beginning, it had only held 3 chairs, one for Norah, one for Elijah, and one for Ruth. But seasons passed, and so did sorrow, and slowly, new voices began to fill the twilight air. It started with a widow and her baby, arriving on a rainy night with nothing but a sack and swollen feet. Norah didn't ask questions. She brought towels, stew, and a warm corner of the house. The woman wept, not from grief, but from disbelief, because kindness, in that town, had become such a rare thing it felt like a miracle. Others came. A boy who had lost his mother to fever. A girl with a bruised arm and eyes too old for her age. An old man who had once been Elijah's neighbor, now blind and alone. His shack burned down years ago for reasons no one remembered, except the hate that caused it. Norah welcomed them all. Their cabin, once quiet and still, grew louder with each new soul. Bread baked daily. Blankets were stitched from scrap. Elijah built bunk beds into the walls. One by one, without complaint, Ruth started a beehive in the back, offering honey to anyone who helped water the herbs by the kitchen window. They had no sign, no church steeple, no official name, but people found them anyway. Because word had spread. There was a place where you didn't need to be clean, proper, or approved to be safe. You only had to show up. Norah, the preacher's daughter who'd once walked barefoot down the town road in disgrace, now stood at her gate in the evenings with a soft smile and an open door. And the people who once judged her? They still passed by, some slowly, some with hesitation, but the stares became fewer, then shorter, then gentler. One day, the same woman who had refused to sell her cloth in the general store brought her daughter to the porch. "She don't read well," the woman mumbled, eyes low. "But I heard you teach." Norah didn't lecture, didn't scold. She simply moved aside and said, There's an extra chair inside. The girl stayed all afternoon. After that, more followed. Children came with dog-eared books and calloused hands. Women came with sewing work. One by one, they came. Not all out of belief, but out of curiosity. Was it really true that the blacksmith and the preacher's daughter lived like husband and wife without marriage papers? That she had raised a girl not born from her womb and still called her daughter? That the baby she carried was being raised among people the town still pretended not to see? Yes, and more. One evening, as golden light spilled over the hills and the fire in the forge sizzled to a close, Elijah sat with his hands coated in ash. Norah came up behind him, belly rounded with new life, and placed a cup of cool water at his side. "Tired?" she asked. He nodded. "But it's a good kind of tired." She sat beside him, barefoot and sun-kissed, her dress stained from cooking, her hair tied back with a ribbon Ruth had made. Around them, the sounds of children giggling mixed with the smell of herbs and baking bread. "I used to think I'd always be surviving," she whispered, "but now, I think we're actually living." Elijah reached over and took her hand. "You built this." "No," she said softly, "we did." That same night, Ruth, now taller and stronger, was helping hang laundry beneath the moonlight. She turned, clothespin between her teeth, and said, "Mama?" Norah looked up. "I've been thinking, when the baby comes, will you love them more than me?" The question hit Norah in the chest, not with pain, but with something gentler, an ache made of love. She walked over, knelt in the grass, and took Ruth's hands. "Listen to me," she said. "You were the first person I chose. The first person who made me believe I was worthy of being someone's home." Ruth blinked fast. "But I wasn't born from you." "No," Norah smiled, "but you were born for me." The girl threw her arms around her, and they stood there, wrapped in warmth that needed no blood to bind it. In the spring, Norah gave birth beneath a sky so blue it looked painted. It was Elijah who caught the child, hands strong and shaking all at once. Ruth who held the warm cloths, and 3 women from the porch who boiled water and sang low hymns while the pain ebbed and the new life cried. A boy, tiny, bright-eyed, his skin a soft brown, his hair curled tight, his hands already gripping the world. They named him Samuel, meaning God has heard. But it wasn't religion that brought the name. It was testimony. Testimony that the world could burn around them, and they'd still find a way to bloom. By summer, the forge was no longer just a place for tools, it was a gathering spot. A school on Wednesdays, a kitchen on Sundays, a prayer circle when grief came too hard and too fast for words. People still whispered sometimes, still questioned, but Norah no longer cared. Because she didn't live for their permission. She lived for the laughter that bounced off the walls, for the smell of rosemary by the window, for the way Elijah still kissed the back of her hand when no one was looking, for the way Ruth called her mama like it had never been a question. And every evening, she stood on the porch as the sky turned violet, watching the ones she loved walk through a world that once tried to break them. She had been cast out once. Now, she welcomed in. She had been called cursed. Now, she was the blessing. And when people asked her who she was, a widow, a teacher, a mother, a rebel, she smiled and said only one thing: "I'm home."